Denise Davidson, and I'd like to welcome you to panel 23. This is a Salon on French identities and cross-cultural exchanges in the age of Atlantic revolutions. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the conference organizers and the hosts working behind the scenes. This has been a wonderful experience, and I'd like to thank everyone for all the hard work that they've put into making this all possible and this opportunity to exchange ideas with people literally all around the globe. Okay, so just to provide a little bit of information on this session, and then we will go ahead and get started. The revolutionary period was a time of growing interaction beyond France. The papers in this session explore various kinds of transnational exchanges and experiences that affected the ways people thought about their lives, their goals, and their identities. The papers examine how culture and identity, as well as commerce and work, were shaped by these experiences. And at a time when our movements are so restricted, they provide a sad reminder of how important and valuable movement can be for expanding yourself and your opportunities. Luckily, however, we have technologies like Zoom to give us some of the benefit of these kinds of exchanges while staying put physically. It's a pleasure to get to exchange ideas with our presenters and with all of you joining us from around the world. We would like to inform you now how to ask questions during the session so that you may submit questions during the presentations. You have two methods to submit questions. First, in the chat box, you may type your question to the host, listed as H. France, which will then be read to the panel. Or second, in the chat box, you may send H. France a note that you have a question and are willing to come on screen to ask it live. After a brief identity check, the host will prepare you to come on screen at the appropriate time. So to introduce our speakers, our three esteemed presenters today in the order they will be speaking are Lloyd Kramer, Professor of History at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, Janet Polasky, Professor of History at the University of New Hampshire, and Sydney Watts, Associate Professor of History at the University of Richmond in Virginia. Their full presentations have been pre-recorded and are available online. Each will just speak for a few minutes today. And then joining in the discussion at today's session is Anne Verjus, Senior Researcher in History and Political Science at CNRS. And with that, I will pass it over to Lloyd.
Well, thank you very much, Denise. I'm very happy to be here. I'm not sure if Janet is with us. Maybe she's still on a cross-cultural journey somewhere, but I'm happy to go ahead and launch the discussion. I want to thank the organizers, as Denise has done, and all the work that TRACY Adams and KIRSTY Carpenter and also David Smith have done to make this happen, as well as many others. What I want to talk about is just to give a very brief overview of the themes that guide my paper. I wrote a paper about how America, the United States, the new American Republic was viewed in France in the period of the 1780s. And I wanted to come back to an issue that had been laid out many years ago by the historian Durand Echeverria in his famous book, Mirage in the West. And of course, that book describes how the French viewed America very sympathetically as a symbol of progress and as a sort of proving ground that progress really works, that political and social progress is possible. But I felt that perhaps the story was more complicated than that sort of classical narrative. And so I went back to some of the key authors, the Marquis de Chastellux, Jacques-Pierre Brissot. Both Brissot and Chastellux visited America in the 1780s and took long trips around the country and wrote about that. And then I also looked at the work of Condorcet and his writings on American politics and society. And although I think Echeverria is correct about this sort of idea of the mirage, what I realized is that the story is much more complicated than that. So my overall thesis is that we have to think about how the mirage for certain writers also represented a point of anxiety or fear, or even, I won't say a nightmare, but a fear that their dream might not come true. So I want to mention just very briefly the main areas in which these writers saw America as representing progress, and then note especially their critique of racism and slavery, which they saw as fundamental flaws in American society. So each of these writers viewed America as a homeland of progress, a symbol of political progress that emerged from defense of liberty and human rights and constitutional government. They also saw America as a symbol of social and economic progress, commercial change, new forms of economic activity. In addition, they viewed this as a center of America as a center of cultural progress, where new kinds of enlightenment and education were developing, a new commitment to reason and religious tolerance. And many of them also believed that women, especially single women in America, had more autonomy and freedom than in France. And then the fourth area of progress was an emphasis on moral progress, that somehow people were escaping the corruptions of the old world, that they had a kind of virtue and simplicity that was lacking in Europe. And all of these themes, the political, the economic, the cultural, and the moral, created this image of progress. But what really interests me is how this narrative of progress was from the very beginning challenged by a kind of counter-narrative of regression. And the key elements of this regressive problem had to do with race and slavery. And every pro-American writer profoundly condemned the practice of slavery, especially in the way it worked in the agricultural system. And they also condemned the growing gap between rich and the poor, which seemed to be stimulating a new luxury trade, and therefore was leading toward the kind of corruption that could happen that already had characterized Europe. That is to say, wealthy people more concerned about luxury goods than political life. So French writers believed that the contradictions of slavery and economic inequality endangered the long-term progress of the new republic and created a threatening gap between the American society that existed in the real world and the ideal progressive future that French writers envisioned for both America and France. And I think these French accounts of institutional racism, particularly the concern about slavery as a fundamentally flawed violation of human rights, this theme becomes all the more relevant as we struggle today with the legacies of institutional racism that we're going to be talking about, I think, in French history and in many other places. And I think also the enduring concern about wealth inequality shows why the themes of these early writers remain so important today. So those are my themes, and I think they emerged in the 1780s, and I believe that many French writers still analyze the same contradictions whenever they write about America.
Since Janet doesn't seem to be with us yet, we'll have to just go ahead to Sydney, and hopefully Janet will be able to join us soon.
Thank you, Denise. And thanks everyone who are here today, and that you're so much a part of this conversation. We've had some excellent presentations this week. I've really enjoyed. My paper is focused on the émigré, particularly women who migrated from and through the Channel, from France and through the Channel to this island of Jersey. It's a relatively small island, 46 square miles, and only 14 miles from the nearest coast of France, the Cherbourg Peninsula. It's an interesting case study to see how the emigration during the Revolutionary era really did include a number of different types of people. So I've been working on a series of documents that document the émigré. These are the Jersey residents, many of whom are getting relief funds through the Alien Act and being registered by British authorities. It gives us a very good social profile of this population. But my focus really today has been to see how this migration specific to women was shaped by economic concerns as much as by political ones. And those who sought refuge in Jersey also forged a livelihood abroad during these revolutionary wars. One of the things I was particularly interested in is how this temporary residency for many lengthened into months and years of foreign resettlement. Many of the emigres who landed even as early as 1789 did not leave till 1802. And we know this again from the documentation of the alien records, from the alien records. But during this period of temporary residency, many were also traveling through. There was a real sense of movement through the channel. There's also a sense that this island was experiencing an incredible refugee influx and a certain degree of economic stimulus and growth. A lot of the records that I've looked at the Jersey archives show how there is a certain amount of, well, a small building boom, and certainly a number of people who were there to fortify the major ports, Saint-Hélier, and also a number of economic opportunities for Jersey residents as much as for these temporary residents. In this case, my main focus has really been on seeing how women in particular saw this as much as an opportunity as a migration that was full of challenges. And for many, I argue that the economic opportunities, particularly for women who had skills or had a profession, could find work in Jersey. And a lot of this comes through the petites annonces and the local newspapers on the island. But we also see a number of propertied women who are making their way to Jersey and also selling their movables, their goods, personal effects, and looking for ways to be enterprising. And so that's one of the themes that runs through the paper. Part of the argument here too is to really see how this migration really couldn't have happened without a sense of autonomy and certainly an understanding that movement was possible and that there may be better opportunities in other places outside of France. Economic migration is a big part of this, but also seeing how professional women and domestic servants really did experience a great deal of autonomy, many of them traveling alone, many of them also traveling with other women. So there's a great degree of what we see in this migration of women taking on the role of head of household for themselves, for their children, and other dependents. Thank you.
Well, maybe I can just say very briefly what Janet's paper was about, since we've planned to have a discussion including it, and hopefully she'll be able to join us soon. But her paper focused on Hamburg as a cosmopolitan city and included analysis of how social interactions between the local Hamburgers, I guess, and French emigres and American merchants and so on. It was very diverse. And she also talked about how that experience shaped people's sense of identity as they interacted with so many people from around the globe. But anyway, I'm not doing justice. I hadn't prepared any kind of a resume of her, a summary of her paper. But anyway, hopefully, like I said, she'll be able to join us. Now that you've heard these two brief presentations, and maybe some of you have seen the full presentations, I'd like to remind you that we are ready to accept your questions and that there are two methods for you to submit them. First, in the chat box, you may type your question to the host listed as H. France, which will then be read to the panel. Or second, in the chat box, you may send H. France a note that you have a question and are willing to come on screen to ask it. After a brief identity check, the host will prepare you to be able to come on screen at the appropriate time. And while all of you are thinking about the questions you'd like to ask, Anne and I have prepared some questions. So I'm going to go ahead and launch an opening question, and then we'll go to Anne to ask another one once our presenters have had a chance to respond. So in the context of the revolutionary era, I'm wondering how you see movement and transnational exchanges providing opportunities and or challenges in some cases for personal growth and for re-envisioning one's sense of self. So would either of you like to start us off on that?
Well, I'll make a comment, and I think Janet has actually written a very interesting book about the movement of people around the Atlantic world. But the point I wanted to make, and I think it's been made by a lot of people, is that identities are always being reshaped through processes of cross-cultural encounters. And one of the remarkable aspects of the age of the Atlantic Revolution is that people were constantly moving back and forth across the Atlantic world, and that their critiques of their own societies were informed by what they encountered in other places. And so that, just to take an example like Brissot is always showing how the French could learn something from what the Americans are doing, even as he's criticizing the Americans. So I think the movement is essential. And by the way, I just mentioned Janet's great book on the movement of people around the Atlantic, and she moved into the picture.
Yes, having mixed up time, sorry.
So, Janet, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Sorry.
And Janet, so Lloyd and Sydney have already given their brief summaries of their longer presentations. Are you ready? Would you like to do that for a couple minutes and then we'll go back to the questions?
Sure, let me just get onto the right screen and I will be very happy to do that. So,
well, if you'd like another minute, we could have Sydney speak for a couple minutes. We were getting started.
No, I can go right now. So thanks for your patience, and so sorry to have missed Lloyd and Sydney. So I'll see where I fit in. But my paper, and I don't know if you've already figured out how many people have read or listened to the papers, but I'm really interested in the cities of Altona and Hamburg. I kept running into them when I was working on the book that Lloyd just mentioned. And what really interested me was that the immigrants that I was finding were not only the aristocrats, but also merchants. And they haven't been written about as much. So what I was really interested in is how these aristocrats and merchants who arrived in these neutral ports, how they mingled together. And because these were cities that saw themselves as cosmopolitan. So I've also been fascinated by the conflicting definitions that Suzanne Desson writes about of cosmopolitanism. And so I was looking at the definitions of cosmopolitanism that come from the cities themselves, the definitions of cosmopolitan as free trade, and we've talked about this a bit, and I know it features in Lloyd's paper, this question that free trade and true liberty were mutually reinforcing, that certainly was the belief of the cities. So then my question was, what happens when you throw aristocratic emigres into this, into the midst? And what I found is that historians have certainly noticed these, the emigres, because they didn't fit. And we often look at conflict as historians. We don't tend to notice the merchants who, as generations before them, had just slid right into the into patterns that were well established. So what I'm really, what I wanted to look at was the patterns of social interaction between the merchants and the aristocrats when they got to Hamburg and Altona, which also then overlaps with Sydney's work, because I'm really interested also in the women who are featured much more prominently in the stories of the aristocratic emigres than in those of the merchants. So what I was, my paper then looks at places where they overlap, at where they socialize together, but also at the very different kinds of domestic scenes, the suppers that are hosted by Hamburg merchants that welcome the merchants. So that what seems to me to be the pattern is there's a lot of movement in this period, and for them, cosmopolitanism means acceptance and outward looking, but acceptance to those who are like them. And I think that's probably important to note, that the aristocrats with a very different sense of movement in this period did not fit. And I think these two notions of cosmopolitanism then clash. And thank you.
Thank you. All right, so we were just getting started to talk about the opportunities and challenges that these movements and interactions that your papers all trace represented. So if you'd like to just answer that quickly, another minute or two, Sydney and Janet, and then we can get on to Anne's questions.
Sure, I can jump in right now. Yeah, so I've been thinking about this, and certainly my focus has been in this paper, understanding material needs in the context of a refugee crisis. And certainly the British respond to the influx of thousands of French people who are arriving in Jersey, certainly in the first wave, not so much, but by 1790, late 1790 and early 91, many more are coming who have virtually nothing. And so the question of material needs and wants for this group of people really does depend on when they arrived and how they arrived. But for many, I think one of the primary concerns that I've been focusing on is this notion of household and how they maintained households, and their sense of household is very important to them, particularly in how they brought their domestic servants with them and made sure that these servants were provided for as well, and how they were willing to let go of these personal effects, but just to make sure that they always had help. And many of them would have female servants, many more than male in this case, to act as governesses, nurses, cooks in some cases. And these people were an important part of maintaining a sense of continuity for themselves, and I think their notion of household. By contrast, you see a lot of these solo travelers, in many cases women who were skilled washerwomen, a lot of governesses as well, but former domestics who are traveling alone or finding work in Saint-Malo just before arriving in Jersey. And so there is a sense that there's a different kind of market for labor in this period. And so there's opportunity for them, dressmakers as well as some luxury goods on the island. People came with their wealth and disposable wealth, and they wanted to create some kind of community among the emigres. Many of them were interested in developing musical groups, reading groups. There's a lot of in the newspapers about different forms of sociability, but these were also opportunities for people to teach music and to give language lessons and all kinds of things. So the question about their resiliency, their self-sufficiency is one that I put in really in the foreground in this paper, and I'm really interested in thinking about how Jersey becomes this little, along the borders here, but really becomes a magnet for people who are following the more wealthy property people, and certainly joining with households and coming along and being supported by their household, heads of household.
And I guess I would just add that I think one of the interesting parts of the question of what material goods come with them, how resilient they are, how they adapt to very different situations. I think that it also shows us, we now often separate refugees who were forced to flee, so that would be the aristocrats. We might put in one camp, and then in a very separate camp, if we're using contemporary politics, would look at the merchants, those who are off seeking opportunities. And one of the things I find so interesting about their interactions is this isn't an either or, it's a spectrum. And so someone like Joel and Ruth Barlow are basically driven out of Paris. They realize when Thomas Paine comes to them with pages of his manuscript that it might be time for them, and followed by the police, obviously, it's probably time for them to leave as well. But they don't only leave, they leave with the right to conduct trade with France. So in some ways they're fleeing France, but at the same time, they're seeking economic opportunity, and they make the fortune that then sustains them for the rest of their life. So you've got that, and then you have the same range of emigres trying to teach French, give music lessons, open cafes. So it's this changing economic opportunities. It's that I think you see with both groups, and definitely an overlap there.
Thank you. Okay, Anne.
Oh, merci. Merci de m'avoir invité dans ce panel. Merci de me laisser parler français, ce sera plus clair pour tout le monde. Merci aux trois panélistes. J'ai une question générale, et puis si ensuite la salle ne rebondit pas, j'aurai trois questions particulières pour chacun et chacune d'entre vous. Ma question générale, elle porte sur le fait qu'on sait qu'il est courant de considérer la Révolution comme un moment d'opportunité, comme l'a dit Denise, pour les individus. Et on sait bien que l'historiographie récente a beaucoup mis l'accent sur ce qu'on appelle l'agentivité des acteurs et des actrices de la période. Et bien sûr, on sait, on le voit à travers vos trois papiers, que ces hommes et ces femmes se saisissent des possibilités de fuir quand ils le peuvent, ou de simplement voyager pour comparer les différents systèmes politiques. Et donc, en fait, on voit bien que partir, que ce soit pour s'enfuir ou pour découvrir, reste quand même encore une voie d'accès à des horizons qu'on considère ouverts, accueillants, des fois même exaltants, mais pas menaçants ni mortifères. Alors, ma question, elle porte sur les modalités différenciées de cet accès aux opportunités de l'exil. C'est-à-dire que quelles sont, d'après vous, les différences de statut, de classe, de race, qui viennent relativiser éventuellement, soit pour les limiter, soit pour les faciliter, mais je pense évidemment plus aux limitations, parce que les facilitations, on vient de les voir, mais quelles sont les différences de statut, de classe et de race qui viennent relativiser ces différentes expériences de la liberté que vous observez chacun, chacune sur votre terrain?
Okay, thank you. Can I go ahead, Denise, on that particular question? Because the people I'm talking about aren't refugees or immigrants in the same sense as the people that Sydney and Janet are discussing. There's no question that the people who are able to travel to America and write about it are privileged people. They are supported by, well, in the case of Chastelouz, he's a general in the French army, so he's in a very specific position. Brissot is supported by business interests and bankers and is reporting on those experiences, economic experiences. So these are privileged people. They're well educated. But what I find striking is how the experience of leaving France and being in a very different culture transforms their sense of status and identity. That is to say, this is a moment, even before the French Revolution, in this moment between the American Revolution and the French Revolution, where there is a growing consciousness of the meaning of privilege. And what these French writers are aware of is how they come from a society in which privilege is very important. And somehow they become more aware of that. That would be my argument. And I think this is where I actually have gotten new sense of this, of our own kind of upheavals right now. We are all rethinking the meaning of privilege. And I think what would have passed without being noticed even 2 years ago or a year ago gets noticed in a new way now. And it's almost as if everyone is being forced to move into a new country, a new culture, a new context that alters their sense of selfhood. What I want to suggest is that that experience for certain writers in the 1780s coming from France had that disorienting impact. And even though they were aware of their status, the meaning of their privilege changed because of this encounter with difference, with the other.
Merci.
Sydney, or?
Yeah, I'm just thinking of picking up on something that Lloyd said, which is that disorientation. And certainly one of the greatest challenges for many of those who arrived on the island was the crossing. I mean, just getting to this place, it was fairly difficult to get to and could be treacherous. And there were shipwrecks on during some parts of the migration. We know about people who were actually lost at sea. And for many, the migration was, it seemed to be relatively short and in proximity to France, but it did feel like enough of a separation to feel that you are isolated from what was happening on the mainland. And and I think that definitely affected people differently according to age. And in this case, there were some very old residents, refugees who stayed and did not return. And they were in their 70s and a couple in their 80s. And so these were quite old and in some cases infirm. They were not able to make the trip back. There were also some very young people who arrived. I have a couple of really interesting stories about a young boy who was brought over with his parish priest and made his way to London and then to school, found his way into a school and did quite well. So, I think for some of the younger people, certainly the young women who came with their families and later found their husbands on the island, were married and had children. It's a very different experience, 10 years living on this island and to really set down some roots and then to return. The parish schools that were there were set up for the French emigre in particular, and they did really want to have some sense of continuity. So yeah, I do think that according to age and generation, it could really be very different for men and women. And I also think that there were instances where, we definitely see how an understanding of the movement, as I mentioned earlier, as an opportunity could be part of a larger trajectory in this movement into industry. And I think a lot about the migration of young women into the cities and how solo travelers, female solo travelers, are really seeking an opportunity in another location that is burgeoning, you know, a burgeoning population. You know, there's a lot of literature on female wanderers, and Fanny Burney is one. Charlotte Smith talks about her wandering or other wanderings, and Mary Wollstonecraft, of course, talks about her own. And I think in this case, these women who are highly educated and very thoughtful have had a lot of encounters with these refugees and females who come from France during the Revolutionary Wars. And I think they're very much impressed by their encounters, as much as someone like Mary Wollstonecraft herself was in Paris during the Revolution and saw a lot of this movement and was limited in some ways too. So, you know, women had challenges in this sense, and they also had the I think in many cases, opportunities to write about it, which gave them greater freedom. And certainly among the more propertied and more educated women, this was something that they chose to do often, is to write their memoirs, to write novels, to write about their experiences.
Thank you.
Yeah, and a carryover would be Mary Wollstonecraft, who was not only in Paris at the beginning, but she actually is in Altona in 1795. So she arrives just after the Joel and Ruth Barlow leave, and she's one of these people who condemns commerce, which has been taken quite seriously by a number of historians. And I sometimes wonder if what she's condemning is in fact the sort of wild goose chase she was sent on by Imlay to go to find this disappeared silver that was on a ship, and that's just as her relationship with Imlay is breaking up. But yeah, so she's definitely a character who continues. And I also think of that carryover in terms of women from the panel the first week on from the conference on women travelers. And what I found so interesting was also that I don't find the merchants who are coming, even those who have crossed the Atlantic, but they've already been somewhere in Europe, I don't find them commenting much on difference at all. They seem to flow right into the, they're accepted within these circles in Hamburg where senators are inviting 80 people. I still can't imagine how you would do that week after week, but they're inviting 80 people to their house for dinner every Friday or every Sunday, depending on which household it is. And you know, sometimes people complain about it was just sandwiches, but it also, the comments on those dinners are on how easy it was to fit into the domestic life of these port cities. Well, that comes from the merchants. That does not come, the people who notice the difference, again, I think are the aristocrats, because for them, this involves, as you're talking about it, it involves a change in class. So for example, the Comtesse de Bontique tells her granddaughter that she will always remain, quote, a German and an aristocrat from the crown of her head to the soles of her feet. She will remain loyal to the noble house of Austria. And then she goes on and that makes her a good cosmopolitan because she's living somewhere else, even though she's loyal to a different country. So I think it's different from Sydney's immigrants. What I also find is the everyone who comes to Hamburg and Altona comments on how easy it is to access these two cities. That is, they could have gone to London, they could have gone to Philadelphia, but this is sort of like just up the road. It doesn't involve expensive travel by sea. And it also then is easily connected by all of the newspapers to home. So in some ways, I don't find the kind of difficult adaptation that others do in other places. I'm thinking, Kirsty, of your work on what happens when they get to London. That is, there seems to be a much more fluid adaptation. And so I was thinking of it also in terms of your question of liberty, because and what liberty means. Because I don't find much disjuncture between what these incoming merchants mean by liberty and what the civic republicanism of the ports where they land. That is, it seems to be the shared sense of a moderate American revolutionary liberty that they can somehow find from France.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Okay, we have a couple questions from the audience that I will read one at a time. The first one is a question from Vivian Gruder for Lloyd. She asked, did any of these writers comment on the existence of slavery in the French Caribbean colonies? And she adds, she knows that Brissot became active in the abolition movement upon his return to France.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Brissot in particular was very aware of the slavery issue in the French Caribbean. Even in the beginning of his book about his trip to America, he talks about encountering merchants and people who are involved in the slave trade in Western France. And he is a staunch critic of the French slave trade as well as the practice of slavery in the United States. I must say, I've read about Brissot as a figure of corruption and as a figure who was problematic during the Revolution in some ways. But in terms of his views of slavery and race, he was one of the most advanced thinkers of the day. And he was very critical of slavery in the French colonies as well.
Okay.
I also found that some of the merchants who were in Hamburg were major slave traders, and it never enters into any of the literature. I happen to know that they were trading slaves from the commercial records, but I see no record of it in any of their, obviously in their memoirs, but in any of the correspondence or any critiques of any of the political pamphlets.
So one other thing about Brissot that's very striking, he explicitly refutes arguments about, mental difference or the inferiority of Black workers. He consistently refutes that argument. And that's why I say he's the most anti-racist of all the writers.
Okay, we'll go on to the next question. So this question is from Tip Reagan. He says, great papers, thank you. In Lloyd's paper, the perceived and constructed sense of place played a very important role in the ideas of the French thinkers whom he explores. Janet and Sydney, in your research, is there something distinctive about the sense of place, even if unstable, in Jersey and Hamburg? Or is it just as they are outside of France and provide opportunities given the political and economic challenges of the time?
So let me make sure I understand the question, that it's not just an experience of intellectual or cultural encounter, there's an experience of place, of geographical space that is transformative and that makes people very aware of their identity, that place alters selfhood as well as ideas and language.
Right, and I think Tip is saying that your paper explores that explicitly, and he's wondering now if Sydney and Janet found any traces of that sense of place having significance in the people you were studying.
I would say it's at the center of the new book I'm writing, which looks at Hamburg and Altona as the first of small places. And so I think place plays an essential role in their ability to offer asylum. So what I'm looking at is asylum. It makes Hamburg and Altona, Hamburg being an independent city-state, Altona the second largest of the Danish cities, but because of its distance from Copenhagen, relatively autonomous, that is tied to Hamburg through the stock exchange. And what I find is that my argument is that because they are such small places, they are more outward looking. And it's an argument that they actually don't really have, and they don't want to enforce borders. But I also think, which would make them very different from the warring countries, I mean, they see these armies marching all over the place around them. And the only way they can survive is by having this diplomatic neutrality, which means sort of this careful and precarious balance that maintains that diplomatic neutrality that will guarantee them free trade, because otherwise they won't survive. So I'm very interested in place, and I also think place plays a role just in terms of what encourages. It's obviously because they're on the Elbe River, because they have this easy access to the North Sea, because of where they are, that makes them they become.
Yeah, I would also say that Jersey is a very important and unique in some ways place, and certainly for the refugees, it's a first landing on their way to other destinations. They go through Jersey to London. Others really find it a destination because of, again, its proximity to the mainland, to the continent. And I think in this case, it's because it's French speaking, because it has been such an important place for Huguenots, because it is a place of exile, you know, for Charles II and for others who chose to go to from Britain to Jersey. At this moment, it is held by the British military, and it becomes an important base for espionage and really the launching of the counter-revolutionary attack at Quiberon Bay, which was a failed attack, but it was planned by French emigre military leaders who were there. And there is an important kind of network of spies who are based in Jersey. And so it's an interesting spot in many ways. It becomes changed after Quiberon. I think that's a dramatic moment for the population. And so there are many widows and orphans as a result of the failed expedition that ends, you know, in a complete massacre. And so that the population is really suffering after that moment, and many of them, there's a greater need for help and different kinds of material aid, but there's also a special supplementary aid for people who are not only ill, the very old, the very young, but also who have mental distress. And so I think there is, in this case, an interesting response on the part of the locals, and certainly the commission that was in London. It was overseeing all of this aid to refugees in London and in Jersey. But you know, Jersey is interesting because it is part of the Channel Islands, and it does seem so much linked to France. And there's a lot of interesting work, geological work from the 17th and 18th centuries that really did forward this idea that it had once been part of the mainland. And so that there are places where you could walk literally over the rocks to the island, and that sense of connection to France is very strong. even though it is, at this time, it is occupied and held by the British.
Great, thank you for this. Okay, it looks like we might be able to have a moment to look at, to hear from Anne a little bit, and maybe you could pose one question at a time for our speakers.
Avec plaisir. J'ai une question à adresser à Sydney. Je voudrais souligner que l'accent que tu mets sur la monétisation des compétences des jeunes gens, des jeunes femmes qui sont en quête de revenus supplémentaires. J'ai trouvé cet accent absolument fascinant dans ton papier. Et je me demande dans quelle mesure ces activités nouvelles exercées par ces jeunes gens, activités qui sont désormais rémunérées, je me demande dans quelle mesure elles perdurent dans le temps, c'est-à-dire au-delà de l'exil. Et si elles perdurent, qu'est-ce qu'elles changent à l'économie familiale? Et puis, j'ai une autre question parce que ça vient les unes après les autres, mais est-ce qu'on observe une différence entre les femmes de la noblesse et les femmes de la bourgeoisie? Je me demande aussi comment situer cet accès qui est de circonstance à un travail rémunéré pour ces femmes dans l'histoire plus générale du travail des femmes. Alors bon, c'est une question un petit peu large la dernière, les autres sont plus précises.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I've thought about this a bit, and it is a big question, and I think one of the things that I tried to show in my paper was that there is a continuity from earlier periods, certainly, when we think about women who were in the trades and who were really economically independent, and the sense of property and the management of property for propertied women at the upper levels of society was also fairly independent. And so there's a lot of sense here that comes out of work that's been done on the 18th century to really see how that sense of autonomy and agency on the part of women who have really worked for their own livelihood or managing property for husbands who are overseas or absent in some way has really carried on into this period of migration. Now, what happens afterwards is really interesting when you think about their return and how they are very carefully trying, certainly propertied women are very carefully trying to reconstruct what they can claim and what they can get back from that period of exile. And so the Indemnity Bill of 1825, there's some terrific records there. And I found a number of records that actually come from these Jersey emigres and who returned to Brittany and came back to really restart their lives. A lot of them were certainly thinking that their exile would be very short and that this would only be a few months. And certainly that lasted much longer. And in this case, I think that a sense of certainly the challenges that they faced were when they felt that their resources were coming thin. And there was a period on the island when the subsidies the refugees were receiving from the British were running low, and there was a real push to get them back to France. And so I think, the question of whether or not they really felt that they could maintain a sense of their lives and how they wanted to live on the island is an interesting one to think about, because clearly their resources were running thin in some cases, especially for widows and women who were living independently. Now, for non-propertied women, I think that's a very different question. And there's certainly a lot of study on domestic service as becoming more feminized and becoming more contractual. In this case, a lot of the domestic servants who stayed behind were participants in some of the early journées of the French Revolution. And so this is something that Rudé has actually written about. And it's interesting to think about the politicization of domestic service in this period. And those who decided to actually emigrate with their masters is, I'm sure, a very different point of view, but many of them did break away from their households and moved on to other places. So their consideration of attachment to their households is really changing in the late 18th century and becoming much more of a free movement of labor, and the ways in which domestic service is changing, I think, is really important and actually perhaps accelerated during this period. I could venture that. So,
Merci.
And before you ask your next question, we have another from the audience. We want to make sure they get their chance in. So this is a question from KIRSTY Carpenter for Janet. In Altona, immigrants wanted or needed to get letters to France. How much did this explain their willingness to integrate into the local commercial society?
A fascinating question, and I have no idea, but that, but KIRSTY, I think that makes a lot of sense. That certainly they know, the emigres know who's going back and forth to France. One of them would be Georg Sieveking, who's also the one that has, his wife actually, has these 80 people over for dinner. And some of the French emigres do go there. And I had never thought of that before. But in some ways, are they then maintaining these connections sort of while holding their nose, because they then will go home and complain about Sieveking and the democratic ways of these merchants. To what extent are they relying on them? I think there's also, though, just a lot of, the borders are really porous with Hamburg and Altona. So there's not much restriction on coming and going. And there just seems to be all these, I mean, we talk about the motion of this period, there just seems to be so much movement. So there's always, they seem not to have, Gouverneur Morris, for example, seems to have no trouble finding someone to carry his letters back to France or to America. So, and in fact, I'm thinking, as I think about it, even like Joel and Ruth Barlow have a much easier time getting correspondence to America than they did when they were in Paris. The only people who have trouble, I think, are those who are trying to get information to England. And that seems to be, obviously with blockades, much more difficult. But yes, it's those, I was thinking when Sydney was talking about place, and when you've talked before about going to Jersey and what it took you to actually get there. And I'm thinking of when I, having worked on this and then finally going to the archives in Hamburg and biking to Altona and then deciding I needed to walk that route. How much these practical issues become, we sort of have to get out of the books to really understand them on the ground. And so thank you, KIRSTY. That was a great question.
Yeah, I might add just a quick point here is the interesting fact is the Postal Service came into being during this period on the island, and they realized how much they needed postal service. So yeah, that was something that they created in 1790. And so yeah, there is something there. I mean, the amount of correspondence is enormous, and it is going in all kinds of directions.
May I ask Lloyd a question?
Well, I'm certainly welcoming that if you'd want, if that's okay.
So I'm just really interested in, so you comment about the view of the American exceptionalism and seeing America, you know, the promise of liberty, et cetera, which goes back to Anne's question as well. But then, and that continues to the present day. So what I'm wondering in our current situation, whether the critique, sort of the regressiveness of America as well. So the critique both of the gaps in, I mean, to put it in contemporary language, the incredible wealth gap in this country, and the critique of the racism, which, having just finished reading Stamped, I mean, how much have we forgotten that French critique? Did we forget and then remember it? Or do you see that as well as a continuity in American history?
Well, I think one of the striking things about American uses of French narratives has always been the way they prefer, the Americans prefer the positive accounts of America.
Surprise.
I say the same thing about Tocqueville, for example. There is a lot of criticism in Tocqueville's Democracy in America. And yet what gets extracted is a theme or themes that suggest the exceptional nature of America, the positive elements of American society. What I find so striking in looking at these texts is not that the critique is the dominant theme. It's just that the critique is there, and it disappears from American nationalist self-narratives. I'd be very careful to think that, or to say that the conceptions of race and racism were the same in the late 18th century as we would understand them today. But what is striking, and I mentioned Brissot more than Chastellux, because Brissot really is pointing out the hypocrisy of a culture that defines itself on the grounds of human rights and then systemically denies those rights, not only to enslave people, but also even those who have gained their freedom. And the racism is at the heart of that. And I don't think that there's any place for that in the American narrative at the beginning. Of course, it gets picked up by abolitionists and others in the 19th century, but it is a very complicated problem for people to integrate that into the narrative of American exceptionalism at the beginning. It still is, you know, for many Americans.
Anne, would you like to pose one more question for us?
Oui, ben justement, je voudrais rebondir sur cette question du racisme. Donc, ma question s'adresse à Lloyd. J'ai été très frappée à la lecture des récits français, qui sont des récits quasi sociologiques de l'Amérique révolutionnaire. J'ai été frappée par l'attention qui est justement portée aux questions raciales. Et je voudrais revenir, si c'est possible, sur la discrimination raciale, qui aujourd'hui est une question qui divise beaucoup le champ des historiennes de la race, enfin des historiens et des historiennes. Et je me demandais si on pouvait ou si on devait distinguer une définition politique du racisme, qui serait un système politique qui vise à distinguer des groupes sur la base de leur race, et puis une définition sociale. Il existe des discriminations avant qu'on pense un système politique dont la finalité serait d'organiser une hiérarchie entre les races. Est-ce que tu vois ça, Lloyd, dans les textes des trois auteurs? Est-ce que, selon eux, le système esclavagiste est en fait déjà raciste ou pas? Je suis très, très intriguée par ces différences entre esclavagisme et racisme.
So again, as I was trying to suggest to Janet, I think it's very dangerous for us to use the same categories that we would use in the 21st century of racism. It was not articulated in the same way. I think that, as I've suggested, Brissot was much more critical of the discrimination. Chastellux, on the other hand, he argued that there was a kind of racial difference between blacks and whites, and in effect, he accepted the ideology of racism as it was being articulated at that time. The striking thing was Americans had proclaimed this idea of equal rights, and then they had to justify slavery. So it's at exactly this moment when racism becomes more systematic as an ideology of physical and mental difference. And I think that it was very difficult, as you say, to separate the political and the social, because the social categories of race were so embedded in the complete political exclusion of Black people in America, whether they were enslaved or already free, that it's very difficult to see a difference between the social and the political. But what is striking is that there is a recognition already in the 1780s that the only way you can justify the current system is by a systemic racist ideology, because there is no other way to maintain the contradiction in rights. So the other component, you mentioned the political and the social, the other is clearly the ideological, which cannot be separated from the social or the political. And I just a final point, so much has been written about French views of America and how the French embraced the American Revolution. But I think what is interesting now in our current context is to go back and look at the ways in which the critique of American racism was already emerging at the very beginning.
Thank you very much.
And it's a painful story because it only grows over time.
Well, and Lloyd, don't you find that that critique is almost omnipresent? I mean, I'm thinking of even Dutch nobles who are coming on diplomatic missions. I'm thinking of the end of Crèvecoeur's book, that it's there wherever you're looking, that anybody from the outside is just so struck by the slave auctions. I mean, again, what's Thomas Paine write about first?
Yeah, I mean, there's no question. And even Richard Price, who's another sympathizer in England, you know, and everywhere you look, the people who want to be the most sympathetic to America cannot get over this problem. It's just such a structural contradiction. And in that sense, there's an amazing continuity from the 1780s to what we're dealing with today in terms of Black Lives Matter. How does one confront this structural contradiction? Right. And it wasn't only the French, but the French were certainly aware of it. And I think it also influenced what happened in France when they abolished slavery in 1794.
Okay,
we have to look at that much more carefully. Yeah, go ahead, Denise.
Another question from the audience. And this one is for Sydney, and it's from Tommy Barr. The refugees that you've been considering followed within a generation or two of the earlier religious refugees. So he'd like to know if you are finding references to how interactions with earlier arrivals went, or any sense of difference. Did any sense of difference remain?
Yes, there were significant interactions, and part of this was the conflict over creating new parishes, Catholic parishes on the island, and with the influx of priests, and these are non-juring priests who came to Jersey, and certainly the oversight of some of the bishops who are trying to manage this population as well. There was a real sense of kind of trying to maintain a level of tolerance between the two populations, but there were a couple of incidents that did come out in the newspapers, and folks who were really a little bit concerned about how this might be perceived. And there's an interesting case where some of the Methodists on the island as well, who are actually part of this population, are speaking to both sides. And so it's an interesting moment for this island, which is really seeing such a flux of different religious identities together in a fairly small space, and trying to make sense of how to actually deal with this sudden rise in the population, and those who are actually interested in maintaining their parishes long after the the refugees leave. So yeah, it's an important question. So thank you.
Okay, great. And we have time for Anne's last question then, I think.
Merci. Alors, ma question, la dernière, s'adresse à Janet. Alors, Janet, tu as un petit peu répondu déjà sur la question des aristocrates en parlant de cette femme qui n'est pas Madame de Genlis, mais l'autre qui visiblement se montrait très peu adaptative. Je me demandais si c'était généralisable, c'est-à-dire si le statut d'aristocrate avait vraiment été un frein pour l'intégration des femmes à Hamburg.
Yeah, again, I guess I would say there's a whole range of responses, and it varies from one to another. And I've been wondering how much that variation is a function of their social position and how much that variation is a function of their political positions, if we can separate those two, and what actually has to do with the economic positions, that is, who has to exercise actually a trade or open a cafe. Because there is that whole range from Madame de Genlis, who does seem to adapt pretty well and has this whole parade of people coming through her house, to others who are offended by merchant sociability and who will accept invitations with the diplomats and who then form those diplomatic circles. With Grimm, for example, is there actually, and that's where a lot of their financing comes from. That is, sort of the charity funds come from there. So I have wondered how much, because the exiles will come in waves. So obviously the constitutional monarchists will come at a different political movement or flee at a different time than the ultra royalists who come with the future king himself. So, and try to maintain their hiding. So again, I think it's a question. The answer is it varies. And I need to do some more. I mean, I've got the individual accounts, but how to explain beyond that, those individual variations. And I do have, besides their letters, I also have one informant who writes notebook after notebook that he passes along to the Senate of Hamburg with information on the refugees and who they're socializing with, who's meeting whom, and he overhears a lot of conversations, all of which he writes down, which, if we can, depending on how much we can believe him, is another source of information. And he keeps assuming that the refugees, that the emigres keep to themselves, and that they are not, they're not mixing with the merchant circles. His report, incidentally, is not taken seriously by the Senate. That is, it is very detailed. It extends over a number of years. And there, as far as I can tell, is no action taken by the Senate or by the police, which could be because the person who would be in charge of that in the Senate is also the merchant who's opening his house up to all of the varied groups of refugees on for supper. So he would be reporting on his guests. So.
Okay, thank you.
Could I just follow up on Janet's comment and link it to something Anne said at the beginning about a new interest in this period in individual lives, or the options that individuals had, the opportunities as well as the obstacles. And I think that what we're all looking at shows how individuals were making choices. This is something Janet develops in her book, Revolution Without Borders, is everybody's life is kind of in free fall over a period of these decades, and how to reconstruct one's life in a period where the old parameters are breaking down. And I mentioned earlier that we're kind of in a comparable period of upheaval, and I feel like I've gotten a new sense of what people were going through when the boundaries that had existed were altered, and they really didn't know quite where to go. You know, we were talking about this. I was so struck yesterday by the panel on publications and journals, and how is this all going to change, and will we ever write in the same way we once did, or will we ever publish in the same way? Or even David Smith saying, well, we now see how privileged we were and how blind we were. It almost reminds me of, you know, like Noble saying, now I see the mistakes I made. And I feel like these individuals have something new to teach us, because they went through an enormous disorientation that can help us engage the same problems in our own time. And Janet's book, I keep shouting out Janet's book because this Revolution Without Borders shows how people struggled because they had no idea where this was headed. And that's why I find it so engaging to consider these problems of exile and disorientation today.
Yeah, I'll say thanks, Lloyd. But I also wonder how much we learn by also looking at some of the emigres who were so intent on going back to, so for them, exile was this period in between, right? There was this great life, then there was this catastrophe, this disaster, this crisis. They're now in limbo, which is where we're studying them, right? And then they assume that they'll go back to the old world again. And to my eyes, as I read them before COVID, thought, how foolish. You know, why would you ever think you could go back and recreate something that existed before? And then I read all my students saying, you know, we want the university to look just like it did before March. And we're making the same kind of comments. So I wonder how much we as historians will be better at understanding people in times of great uncertainty, since we're living through it, not knowing what's coming next or how long we're going to be in this situation without those guardrails.
You know, like Talleyrand famously said, no one who didn't live through the old regime can imagine how pleasant it was, or something like that. We someday say, you can't imagine what universities were like when, 30 years ago or 20. It's like the old regime. The old regime is gone. And these exiles, these travelers, these people who are wandering the world are kind of engaging with the problem of you can't go home again, but you want to. And I find that fascinating.
Except they're traveling and we're staying still, but.
That's true. We don't move anywhere. We just do all our traveling on Zoom.
There's another thread here that might be interesting, which is this idea of the new domesticity and how, so many people are learning how to, like me, play piano or bake bread, and trying to find sort of meaning in the life at home. And there's certainly Margaret Darrow and others have made the argument about how aristocratic women return to this domestic space, and they really are looking for a sense of well, they know things have changed, but they're trying to create something secure within their homes. And this is where I think Balzac is terrific, because he really is focused so much on this world of the salon and the dinner table and the interior spaces, that there is no movement, right? It's very static. And I think about how how so many noble women and certainly a lot of women who are part of those circles are really trying to see that the life within the home, that these romantic relations and all kinds of etiquette books focused on how to behave at home, how to be proper. There's a real sense of distinction that happens in women's education at this point, trying to make or at least exude a sense of difference for those propertied women who are not working, who are at home. And I think about that a lot, and the kind of privilege that you're talking about too, Lloyd, and that we have the privilege of having, some people in this country certainly having large homes, even summer homes to go to. We're not locked in. And then I think about people in small apartments or in very crowded conditions, and how, in the city of Richmond, there's such an inequality in the way COVID is touching different populations. And a lot of it has to do with the way they live. So yeah, I do find that class is such an important marker here in this period of exile and return, and how it becomes more accentuated when people do return. Yeah, and I wonder about how certainly some of the privileges that were lost have to be reasserted in a particular way.
But it also may be why we're, as historians, drawn to periods of conflict and revolution, because that's when these differences, these conflicts become, these separations become all that much clearer. So that just as now we're so much more aware, I mean, it's not coincidental that racial differences have come to the fore, that racial issues have come to the fore now. So that I think that, Black Lives Matter is not separate from COVID as much as we sometimes will try to separate our issues. But I'm thinking also that this is where we really do see the different groups living the experience very, very differently. So that those of us who are in houses where there's lots of space are going to experience COVID much differently than someone in a cramped apartment who's just lost their job, and that it almost makes it two worlds. And we certainly see that in the Revolution and in exile as well, the separations and the divisions.
Well, I'm thinking maybe, I'm looking at the time, I'm thinking maybe this is a good way to wrap up. And I think it's been wonderful the way that you've all managed to connect your research to our own lived experiences today. It helps us, I think, both understand where we are today and understand the past better. I think it goes in both directions. So thank you, all of you, for participating today. Before we go, I want to remind everyone that there is one more week of these virtual conference sessions coming up, the SFHS and Rudé conference. So stay tuned. Make sure you look at your email to keep track of the announcements of the upcoming events next week. And of course, it's all available.
And pay attention to the time.
And pay attention to the time. That's a good idea.
Be in the right time zone.
Let me just say a special thank you to Anne for joining us from France late at night. And thank you, Denise, for being such a good questioner. We don't have all the answers, but we certainly do enjoy the questions.
And thank you to David, who has worked long hours to keep our bumbling under control.
And even digging up Janet's phone number so that he could get you.
Right.
So thank you, all of you. And I'll look forward to seeing you again in Zoom next week. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.